My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. It has become abundantly clear that amid an explosion of violence in America's cities, the Biden administration has absolutely no intention of going after the criminals or the anarchists of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Instead, they have decided to target you. As we will discuss later in the show, the administration recently released its, quote, national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. And in that document, nowhere does it mention the violent anarchists who burned American cities. And of course, what are at issue are what the document calls domestic violent extremists. And who are those domestic violent extremists? Well, you, of course, if you feel the government is, quote, overreaching its power, since, and I quote, perceived government overreach will almost certainly continue to drive domestic violent extremist radicalization and mobilization to violence. And what is the cure for all this domestic violent extremism? Why, confiscating guns, of course. We'll discuss this together with the administration's continuing effort to politicize law enforcement. But first, this just in gun rights news. On the legal front, the Trump appointments to the Supreme Court are the gifts that keep on giving. First, SCOTUS agreed to take up the case New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Corlett over whether New York's concealed handgun permit system violates the Second Amendment. Incidentally, my organization, Grassroots North Carolina, is a party to the amicus brief on this case. Now, just days ago, Texas joined 21 states in petitioning the court for a writ of certiorari on Young versus Hawaii, also pertaining to the right to bear arms outside the home. Said the brief, and I quote, inconsistent decisions by the lower federal courts have left states uncertain as to the precise boundary between permissible and impermissible restrictions. These inconsistencies have also prevented citizens of amici states from exercising their right to carry and bear arms across state lines. North Carolinians may recall that our case, Bateman versus Purdue, was intended to be a test case for the Supreme Court to rule on bearing arms outside the home, since the Heller and McDonald cases dealt solely with keeping arms in the home. Unfortunately, we won the case, on Second Amendment grounds, I should note. I say unfortunately because the state, reading the tea leaves, chose not to appeal, meaning it never went to the high court to become precedent-setting law. The good news, however, is that we were able to go back and repeal the now unconstitutional blanket ban on carrying arms outside the home during declared states of emergency, meaning the next time BLM riots in a North Carolina city, and there will be a next time, you can legally carry arms to protect yourself. Elsewhere in Supreme Court news, in a 6-3 split, which is now becoming characteristic of the more conservative court, thank you, Donald Trump, it rules that Arizona's ban on ballot harvesting and out-of-precinct voting does not violate the Federal Voting Rights Act, preserving the integrity of elections and causing the left to scream bloody murder that one of their many efforts to seize power was rebuffed. To give you an idea, let's take a look at two headlines. From the Epoch Times, a conservative paper, a neutral headline, and I quote, "Arizona ballot harvesting ban is legal. Supreme Court rules in high-stakes electoral integrity case." Now from the left, from Roll Call, and I quote, "Supreme Court weakens another Voting Rights Act provision. Schumer calls decision simply unconscionable." Nope, no bias there. Incidentally, the decision bodes ill for the many lawsuits filed against Georgia's new voter integrity law, and indeed a lower court ruled against one suit just yesterday. In November, I never would have believed it, but we just might have honest elections in America. Elsewhere, the Texas Supreme Court just struck down a lawsuit against a retailer over the legal and correct sale of the firearm used in the Sutherland Springs church shooting. A shooting which, ironically enough, was stopped by Stephen Williford using an AR-15. The Texas court ruled that because the retailer did a correct background check, he was protected by the Lawful Protection of Lawful Counters and Arms Act, signed into law by President George W. Bush in 2005, which protects gun manufacturers and sellers from being sued over products that function as intended. You may recall that back in the 1990s, there was an effort to sue gun manufacturers out of business by a variety of cities. And last in legal news, the United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals has granted an en banc rehearing of Gun Owners of America versus Garland. This case involves the ATF's decision to reclassify bump stocks as machine guns, even though they're not firearms at all. Whether or not you care about bump stocks, this case is extremely important since it deals with whether the ATF can arbitrarily reclassify items under the doctrine of Chevron deference. A three-judge panel of the Sixth Circuit had ruled against GOA, so getting an en banc hearing of the full court is good news. Incidentally, Grassroots North Carolina has also signed on to this case with GOA. More on this as it develops. Speaking of malfeasance by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, John Crump, writing in AmmoLand.com, reports that, and I quote, "AmmoLand News learned through a leaked Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, conference call that the agency is starting to run gun buyers retroactively through the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS. You may recall that within the Brady Act is a provision allowing states which meet certain standards to allow the use of concealed handgun permits to bypass the computerized National Instant Background Check System. Some gun owners like to use concealed handgun permits, which, thanks to GRNC, can also be used to bypass the need for a pistol purchase permit from the sheriff, because they feel it provides a layer of anonymity from the ATF. Well, apparently not so much. Lately, the ATF has withdrawn the NICS exemption from several states, principally Michigan, claiming that background checks were not being done properly for concealed handgun permits. Well, that would be one thing. But it seems that according to Crump, they are running background checks retroactively. So the question becomes, how do they know who to run background checks on? In theory, data should make it from the Form 4473 you fill out at a sale, which stays in the dealer's inventory after a sale only when the dealer goes out of business, there's a trace request, or the buyer purchases multiple handguns. So how exactly is the ATF getting access to this data? There have been reports in the past of the ATF illegally copying 4473s and using them to create a gun registry in violation of both the Brady Law and the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act. Are they once again absconding with 4473s? More on this as it develops. Oh yes, remember this. when the next time somebody tells you you have to be reasonable and adopt so-called universal background checks. What they really want to do is to capture all firearms transfers in NICS, including private transfers, private sales, in order to create a better universal gun registry, since, after all, they can't ban what they can't find. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return to discuss how the left is blaming you for the explosion of violence they created. My name is Paul Vallone. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. I've been saying for some time that totalitarian woke ideology makes it easier for me to understand how the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia could kill 3 million of its own people and send more to re-education camps. A regime under which even the ability to read and write was grounds for persecution, where to avoid being targeted, people did not wear eyeglasses, no one dared speak French, and reading a novel was considered a capital offense. Well, apparently I'm not alone in thinking so. The Epoch Times recently published a piece entitled "Woke Ideology Mimics Precursors to Totalitarian Slaughter," experts say. The Epoch Times goes on to say, and I quote, "A recently released documentary exploring the topic, called Better Left Unsaid, concludes that the self-identified radical left endorses 4 fundamental truths that they hold to be self-evident, noting that these tenets have been used to justify and incite many of the worst massacres of the 20th century. The first of the 4 claims is that the, quote, world is best viewed through a group oppression narrative lens, based on a set of quasi-Marxist theories that divide society into oppressors and the oppressed. The second claim is that the evidence of oppression is the inequality between groups. The third claim is that the peaceful dialogue and understanding between the groups is impossible, since the dominant group's strategy is to retain power. And finally, the ideology at least implicitly acknowledges that because of the above, violence is justified to eradicate the inequities. The author of the documentary, Kurt Jemengal, says, quote, "From my experience, they, the left, tend to advocate for violence against those oppressing and equate it to laudatory behavior, hence punch a Nazi." He says, "I have catalogs of tweets, written statements, and videos of people ranging from students to professors, explicitly calling for violence and downplaying the violence of those on the left when compared to the right." He added, "Not because of intensity or frequency of such violence, but because of the so-called nobleness of the extreme left's position. These 4 tenets Jemengal demonstrated in the documentary are common to many of the most brutal massacres and regimes of the 20th century, from the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany to Communist China and the Rwandan genocide." Jemengal's conclusions were also recently endorsed by several scholars of totalitarianism, all of whom are critical of woke ideology. They were invited to comment on the film by Pat Kambhampati, chemistry professor and head of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship at McGill University in Canada, who says, quote, "The same ideas that gave rise to Kurt's movie and the discussion of communism, we see a lot of parallels and isomorphisms taking place in the West and within academia." Also featured in the film, Janice Fiamengo, retired English professor at the University of Ottawa, backed Jemengal's argument during the panel discussion, saying, and I quote, "As soon as one establishes these oppressor groups and oppressed groups, then when you are speaking supposedly on behalf of the oppressed, you can do nearly anything." In North Carolina news, The good news is that we've been able to pass Senate Bill 43 for concealed carry in churches, which sponsors schools. You may recall that although it's always been legal to carry firearms in churches, if the church sponsors a school, it becomes educational property, where firearm carry is a felony. S43 would allow concealed carry in those churches provided it is outside the hours of school curricular or extracurricular activities. The bad news is that Roy Cooper, our leftist governor, did what Roy Cooper does. He vetoed the bill, meaning that we now have to override the veto. And although there were enough votes when it passed to make up the 3/5 supermajority of each chamber to override the veto, some of them were Democrats, who will be under pressure by the Democrat governor not to override his veto. Consequently, we need you to go to grnc.org and click on the quick links on the left, where you will find an alert telling you which Democrats to email and a copy and paste message that will allow you to make your voice heard in just a couple of minutes. Go to grnc.org, that's grnc.org. We've also made progress in repealing North Carolina's Jim Crow-era pistol purchase permit law, which you may recall was passed in 1919, a year after Missouri passed it, in response to race riots in St. Louis in 1917. It allowed sheriffs to deny blacks to guns under its vague good moral character clause. More recently, it's been used for a variety of abuses, the worst of which were displayed when Wake County Sheriff Gerald Baker stopped issuing permits altogether early in the COVID pandemic, denying the burgeoning number of new gun owners the ability to buy handguns for self-protection. We sued, twice in fact, and Baker is now sort of issuing permits. But more important is repealing the law, which we've been trying to do for 20 years. But we made more progress recently after the powerful North Carolina Sheriff's Association, which has historically opposed repeal, reversed its position, calling the archaic law redundant in the face of new technology like NICS. So we recently got House Bill 398 for repeal through the North Carolina House. But we need to get it heard in the more inertia-driven Senate, so please go to grnc.org and click on the alerts on the left side of the page, where you will find a quick and easy way to make your voice heard to Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger and others. Federally, as you recall, we are facing three major threats from the Biden administration. Chief among them is Biden's nominee to head the ATF, David Chipman. In an interview, he treated gun owners as though they were nutcases, saying, and I quote, "Hide it," the gun you just bought, "hide it behind the cans of tuna and beef jerky that you've stored in the cabinet." In his first confirmation hearing, Senator Mike Lee used that quote made to Cheddar News as part of his case to demonstrate the condescension, even loathing, with which Chipman regards gun owners. Senator Lee's highly valid point is that Chipman, who has served as a lobbyist for 4 gun control organizations since leaving his position at ATF, has a long history of making dismissive and vindictive comments toward gun ownership. Comments which caused Lee to ask, and I quote, "How does this reflect the careful, measured judgment of one who would be in charge of enforcing our nation's gun laws?" Comments which have included false claims that the Branch Davidians shot down helicopters at Waco with .50 caliber Barrett rifles, except that no Barrett rifles were ever recovered at Waco, and Chipman knows that because he was one of the investigators there. Comments on Reddit that he would like the opportunity to arrest people before they commit crimes. Anybody here ever see the movie Minority Report? Pre-crime, anyone? Comments that included in commenting on a bill to make it easier for people to protect their hearing by getting sound suppressors, said, and I quote, "The only people that benefit from this bill are gun lobbyists and criminals who want easier access to deadly weapons." Chipman, of course, tried to dismiss these comments as misunderstood and taken out of context, when in truth the context in which they should be considered is his long expressed antipathy toward gun ownership. But the most relevant thing are Chipman's policy positions, all of which favor gun control. And specifically, which gun controls, you ask? Well, we don't know exactly because he repeatedly dodged the question. He clearly supports a ban on the semi-automatic firearms in your possession, saying in response to questioning from Senator Ted Cruz, quote, "With respect to the AR-15, I support a ban as has been presented in the Senate bill and supported by the President." But although he says he supports the ban on those nasty old assault weapons, a name, by the way, which was created by gun control organizations to make semi-automatics sound evil, the problem is that under repeated questioning by Senator John Kennedy, he wouldn't define exactly what he means by assault weapon. He also did his best to dodge when asked by Senator Tom Cotton what constituted an assault weapon, first trying to dodge by saying it was whatever Congress said it was. But when pushed further, particularly with respect to what he considered an automatic weapon to be what he was lobbying for gun control, he finally settled on a definition of semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine. That's what he calls an assault weapon. Any semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine. Translated, that means Chipman wants to ban nearly every semi-automatic rifle in possession in the United States. Your hunting rifle? Gone. Okay, your father's BAR that he used to hunt deer with? Gone. Well, grab a pen, because even if you have previously registered your opposition to Chipman, after a short break, there are 3 legislative offices I need you to call. Right now, you're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. After our break, we will tell you how to help stop the Chipman nomination. My name is Paul Vallone. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. If you're just joining us, we've been talking about Joe Biden's nominee to head the ATF, David Chipman, a man even his fellow ATF co-workers call a rabid anti-gun partisan. Chipman wants to ban nearly every semi-automatic rifle in possession in the United States. Now, for you hunters out there, that means not just those nasty AR-15s and AK-47s. Nope, your father's old Browning or Remington semi-auto hunting rifle, gone. Incidentally, you will notice that he referred to these guns as assault rifles. That is how the gun control advocates try to confuse you. An assault rifle, under military terminology, is a fully automatic firearm, a machine gun capable of firing multiple bullets from the single press of the trigger, as opposed to semi-automatics, which fire only one bullet per depression of the trigger. That's how incremental gun bans work. First, they broaden what they regard as they capture what they regard as the low-hanging fruit, things like AR-15 pistols. Next, they begin broadening the definition to, quote, close loopholes. That's what they always call it, closing loopholes in the law, until nothing is left. But make no mistake, the loophole they plan to close is the private ownership of firearms, your ability to own firearms. Oh, and Chipman admitted to Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee that even the 1994 so-called assault weapon ban, which expired in 2004, is, quote, not enough. In fact, when Blackburn asked him whether he would expand the 1934 National Firearms Act, he answered, yes, ma'am. But don't worry, in Chipman's perfect world, you would still be able to keep the semi-automatic firearms you currently possess with one little proviso. You would have to register them under the National Firearms Act. The NFA, Chipman assures us, represents, quote, a good balance of rights and responsibilities, not only for things like machine guns and silencers and short-barreled rifles and shotguns, but also for semi-automatic rifles. So it behooves us to take a look at what constitutes balance in Chipman's worldview. For starters, it isn't just the tax that you've heard Fox News claim, but instead much, much more. To register a gun under the NFA, you must go to your sheriff and get fingerprinted, submit multiple photos, fill out an arcane and difficult Form 4, or in some cases a Form 1, submit notification to your sheriff, pay a $200 tax stamp for each transfer of a gun, undergo an FBI background check, and wait. Wait for a very long time, potentially more than a year. Oh, and if any part of that isn't to the bureaucrats' satisfaction, you get to start all over again. Oh, and we haven't gotten to the requirement for keeping an NFA weapon. For example, you must keep the registration documents with the gun at all times. You cannot loan it to others except under limited circumstances and a letter authorizing them to have it. And you may not travel interstate with a gun without express permission from the ATF. And this, by the way, is only if your state lets you keep NFA weapons. Many states don't. This is what constitutes balance in David Chipman's world. Expressing opposition to Chipman's appointment, former ATF Director Michael Sullivan said, quote, "Mr. Chipman has made it clear over the course of his time as a lobbyist with organizations that are anti-gun and one that has a very restrictive view of the Second Amendment, would suggest a hostility toward both the Second Amendment and the American people's right to exercise their constitutional rights under the Second Amendment to be firearms owners." This is an ATF director talking here. Said a current ATF agent who chose to remain anonymous, quote, "To effectively enforce gun laws, you have to be unbiased and apolitical," he said. "You can't be a partisan. Dave has shown himself to be a rabid partisan. He's shown a propensity who personally attack people who don't share his philosophies. He, I guess, perceives that he is on some sort of platform of righteousness." Elsewhere, photos of Chipman and his family being circulated show them to be affiliated with various left-wing causes, including that his daughter is a big BLM supporter. The bad news is that Chipman's nomination squeaked out of the committee on a tied vote, allowing Chuck Schumer to send it to the floor for a vote of the full chamber without a majority in committee. The good news is that Chipman's nomination seems to be running into problems, but it isn't dead yet. So we need you to drive a stake through the heart of this nomination by calling the following U.S. senators who are reportedly on the fence about his nomination. And it doesn't matter that you don't live in their states, because what they do affects you, and you should tell them so. All of these numbers are 202 area code, because they're in Washington, 202 area code, and the first numbers of all of them are 224. So I say again, each phone number begins with area code 202, then 224. I will give you only the last four numbers. The first one is West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, and you could call him at 3954. Senator Joe Manchin, 3954, as in 202-224-3954. The second one is Maine Senator Angus King, who you can reach at 5344. Again, Senator Angus King, 5344. The third is Montana Senator John Tester, who you can reach at 2644. Again, that's Senator John Tester at 2644. If you missed all that or would rather email, you can also use the legislative alert, which we have linked from our homepage at grnc.org. It's right in the middle of the page, grnc.org. The other threat we need to talk about is the looming deadline for public comments on the ATF's first notice of proposed rulemaking, which is supposedly for ghost guns and purports to regulate what it calls privately made firearms. Now, to the point, maybe you're saying, "Whew, I'm glad that doesn't affect me because I don't have any privately made firearms." Well, not so fast, bucko. If you own an AR-15 or any of the other myriad of modular firearms, like the SIG 320, for example, that are currently in vogue, you may well be in the ATF's crosshairs. You see, another measure in the proposal would redefine what constitutes a frame or receiver of a firearm. The problem, as the ATF sees it, is that at present it is plausible nothing on an AR-15 constitutes a regulatable part. Back in 2019, you see a guy in Los Angeles named Joseph Rowe decided to push the envelope because although legally making a gun without a serial number requires that it be made entirely by yourself, Rowe set up an operation in which customers could walk in and literally press a single button to make an AR-15, which is neither serialized nor had a background check. Unsurprisingly, they eventually prosecuted him. Interestingly enough, though, they dropped the case because apparently, if you look at the definition of a frame or receiver, nothing on the AR-15 meets the definition. So, translated, they wanted to avoid a judge ruling that an AR-15 lower couldn't be regulated, so they dropped the case. Here enter the ever-helpful folks at the ATF who decide to unilaterally change the definition of frame or receiver, and allow me to read from the proposed rule. Under the proposed rule, a frame or receiver is an externally visible housing or holding structure for one or more fire control components. A fire control component is one necessary for the firearm to initiate, complete, or continue the firing sequence, including but not limited to any of the following: a hammer, bolt, bolt carrier, breech lock, cylinder, trigger mechanism, firing pin, striker, or slide rails. More than one externally visible part may house or hold a fire control component on a particular firearm. So, in fact, I was speaking with a lawyer at Gun Owners of America, an excellent organization I suggest you join, by the way, and the way the proposal defines frame or receiver, virtually all parts of the AR-15 would meet the definition because it's entirely plausible the ATF could require each individual part of a gun to be serial numbered, requiring a background check through NICS and a transfer through a licensed dealer, for which would charge you, I don't know, $25 to $50 to do the transfer. So you can imagine having to do that for every bolt carrier, trigger group, or other part for your gun. That would be a nightmare. And that's why you need to register your opposition by making a comment to the ATF. The good news is that we have made it uber simple. All you have to do is go to grnc.org, grnc.org, and you will find an alert in the center of the page giving you a link to the ATF comment form and a copy and paste message to deliver your message in about 2 minutes. We need you to act now because the August 19th deadline for public comment is coming up fast. Go to grnc.org. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with still more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. So, for those of you who are concerned about the explosion of violence in the U.S., I have good news. You don't have to worry about a thing. Because in June, Uncle Joe Biden, just introduced his national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. You've probably heard a little about it, but I want to talk about some of the specifics because after I do, I'm sure you will feel so much better about the future of America. According to the White House briefing room, the plan was concocted because, and I quote, the two most lethal elements of today's domestic terrorism threat are racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race, and anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists such as militia violent extremists. Who knew? And all this time I've harbored the delusion that what we have to worry about are Marxist-fueled anarchists burning down cities and the explosion of urban violence caused by the left coddling them and blaming police for the resulting societal meltdown. But what do I know? In any case, I must be wrong, since nowhere in the document does it mention Antifa or BLM or of the many urban centers they have so far destroyed. Anyways, this is a most impressive 32-page document that lays out clearly what the people running Joe Biden intend to do for America. So this tome identifies the history of the domestic violent extremists in America who are causing our current problems, saying, quote, after the Civil War, for example, the Ku Klux Klan waged a campaign of terror to intimidate black voters and their white supporters and deprive them of political power, killing and injuring untold numbers of Americans. But of course, the document brings the threat up to date for current conditions, and I quote, "Across violent ideologies, individuals and small groups, both formal and informal, have been galvanized by recent political and societal events in the United States to carry out violent attacks. Among that wide range of animating ideologies, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, principally those who promote the superiority of the white race, and militia violent extremists are assessed as presenting the most persistent and lethal threats." Well, I'm thinking the political events he's talking about would be the theft of the 2020 elections, but that's just me. So I'm starting to get a sense of where this is going, since, according to the document, the idea of fraud in the recent general election led to the January 6th breach at the Capitol. Nah, I must be wrong. After all, it says it will protect America's values, especially our cherished civil rights and civil liberties. So it must be okay, right? And of course, Joe is right on top of the situation, having zeroed in on the true threat facing American society, which is the, quote, "significant component of today's threat includes self-proclaimed militias and militia violent extremists who have taken steps to violently resist government authority or facilitate the overthrow of the U.S. government based on perceived overreach. Moreover, that perceived government overreach will, and I quote, almost certainly continue to drive domestic violent extremist radicalization and mobilization to violence." So let's see if I have this right. If you believe the government is overreaching, that makes you, how do they put it, a domestic violent extremist. Gee, that sounds a lot like domestic violence, doesn't it? I'm sure that's just a coincidence. And you domestic violent extremists don't think the fact that you aren't in some militia leaves you out of Joe's plan, because he makes sure to cover all lone actors as well. But don't worry yourself, because Uncle Joe's people will be watching you since, quote, "the IC," that's the intelligence community, assesses that domestic violent extremists exploit a variety of popular social media platforms, smaller websites with targeted audiences, and encrypted chat applications to recruit new adherents, plan and rally support for in-person actions, and disseminate materials that contribute to radicalization and mobilization to violence. Oh, now I understand why the NSA is monitoring Tucker Carlson's emails. Now we come to the good part, how Uncle Joe plans to address these threats. But don't worry about that either, because again, he promises to respect civil liberties and civil rights and privacy protections. Maybe somebody should tell Tucker Carlson that. But the most encouraging part comes from the fourth pillar of the plan, which involves, quote, tackling racism in America, and means, quote, protecting Americans from gun violence and mass murders. Gun violence. Here we finally have it. How the left plans to keep us safe. Uncle Joe's plan emphasizes, quote, reducing access to assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and enforcing legal prohibitions that keep firearms out of dangerous hands. Because after all, we know that stopping domestic violent extremists is utterly dependent on banning guns, right? One of the best indicators of what the Biden administration is after comes not from this publicly released document, but from another one they didn't want you to see, a leaked document from the Joint Counterterrorism Assessment Team. And who do they consider a threat? Well, you, of course, if you plan to produce a privately made firearm. The guns you legally make for yourself, which they're now trying to restrict as ghost guns, even though there's nothing in the Constitution that gives them the authority to regulate firearms that do not move in interstate commerce. Nor is this the only case in which you are being blamed for the explosion of violence in America. First, there was the June 22nd press conference at which the president's personal liar, Jan Psaki, answered the following question. Quote, you said yesterday the president feels a great deal of the crime we're seeing is a result of gun violence, but the stats show it's not just gun crimes. So why does the president think there's been a 30% increase in car thefts in D.C., a 47% increase in robbery in New York City, or a 98% increase in rapes in Atlanta? responds Ms. Psaki, and I quote, "Well, first, I think you have to look at a number of cities across the country. It is actually driven by gun violence." So let's take a look at what she told the media on July 8th after Biden visited leftist Mayor Lori Lightfoot, whose city is one of the Democrat-led cities suffering from their policies. Quote, "From our end," said Ms. Psaki, "what the president conveyed to Mayor Lightfoot is that we will continue to work with her in partnership and work with cities around the country to address the rise of violence, and specifically the rise of gun violence, is predominantly the driver in Chicago." He also reiterated, she goes on to say, as the Department of Justice has announced just a few weeks ago, Chicago is one of the cities that will be a beneficiary of these groups that will go and help directly crack down on combating drug violence and gun violence and gun trafficking, something we're doing in about half a dozen cities across the country. Now, ignore for a moment the idiotic circular reasoning that gun violence is the cause of gun violence, rather than the result of policies like defunding police, letting violent criminals out on bail, or refusing to prosecute them. Notice that she twice corrected herself. First, she stopped from saying that there has been a rise in crime, instead substituting gun violence. Second, she stopped herself from saying drug violence and drug trafficking, again substituting gun violence and gun trafficking. What you are hearing are administrative talking points to blame gun ownership for the violence their own policies are causing. Elsewhere, we're seeing the same strategy from leftist Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, who just declared a gun violence emergency in New York City, where homicide is spiking, again in response to Mayor de Blasio's leftist policies. I'm sure you've already said that these idiots were wrong, but they aren't wrong. If you, as an honest, well-meaning soul, think all of this means that Joe Biden's handlers are misguided, it is you who are wrong. I want you to know what you're looking at. The interplay of not just one but two leftist strategies. The first is the standard socialist tactic of creating a problem, then deliberately creating a problem, and then solving it through the increased control. This is not an accident. The second is called preemptive accusation, blaming you for what they are doing before you can say it, thereby shielding themselves from the accusation. Psaki also said on June 23rd, and I quote, "Some might say that the other party was for defunding police, all because congressional Republicans won't sign off on 2 infrastructure bills. How's that for chutzpah? Blaming Republicans for what Democrats have done in defunding police." These are standard leftist strategies, and the next time you hear them, I want you to say this. First of all, I reject the phrase gun violence because it implies that death by gun is somehow worse than death by knife or baseball bat or improvised explosive device. Death is death, and if you're really interested in preventing it, you would be going after all violence instead of what you really want, which is banning guns. But more importantly, I refuse to accept responsibility for the explosion of violence in our cities that you and your policies have deliberately created. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, where each week we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at HyattGuns.com. See you next week.